Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavai Tejasvinavaditamastu ma vidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Om Peace, Peace, Peace. And good evening. We're continuing with the reading from the complete works of Swami Ramakrishnananda. And you know, anytime you hear a talk from this temple, you are listening to an illumined soul because they have these bright spotlights on us. So we are definitely being illumined here. All right, so we're going to read, a little bit maybe. Yeah. So we have, we're reading from chapter 10 called The Union with God. The very mention of whose divine name purifies us and illumines the heart of all those who have the desire to hear the Lord, because he is always the friend of the good. That's a quote, and somehow the English isn't quite complete, but you get the general sense that the divine name purifies our heart, and we want to have the desire to hear the Lord because he is the friend of the good. All the miseries that are to be found in the hearts of men, he destroys. Miseries are always inside of us and not outside. We think they're outside, but this is not the fact. If you take a log of wood, cut it, burn it, you will not mind. Why? Because it is not conscious. But take a person, insult him, hurt him, and he will feel it. Why? Because he is conscious. Where is that consciousness? Inside. And where inside? It is centered in the heart, not in the brain. A person may have his brain injured, still his consciousness continues, although his mind may be deranged. But enter the heart, and at once consciousness leaves the body. This shows that the chief seat of consciousness is in the heart. Now, good and evil, victory and defeat, profit and loss only exist when we are conscious of them. That is, they exist in consciousness. Therefore, they must be inside. Now, of course, whenever you have people using the word consciousness, it becomes very difficult to get the exact meaning of the word. And here, of course, it's really referring to the illuminating power of the spirit that animates the body. Consciousness in the sense that you are perceiving things and your mind is processing them. Obviously, if the brain is not operating, then those things aren't going to be functioning. But he's talking about the seat of consciousness of the spirit. Obviously, the consciousness is what makes you alive. It's the Atman that makes you alive. And we're going to talk a little bit more later as he gets on in this about the nature of sentiency and consciousness and so forth. The ordinary man of the world believes that all miseries are outside him and beyond his control. For that reason, he is so miserable. But when man has no attachment for earthly things, when he realizes that behind the world there is an almighty power who is all friendly, then his mind will be directed more and more away from the world and towards this all-powerful and all-friendly being. He will seek out those people who will talk to him of God, and he will try to go to those places where people have realized God. These are called holy places because of the holy people that have lived there. As a person goes more and more to such places and talks more and more with such people, the love of the world will gradually leave him and he will come nearer to God. And of course, this is the advantage of going to holy places and seeking holy company. It keeps your mind in the right place, and the vibration of those places and those people lifts your consciousness into a like mind. We tend to get sympathetic vibrations, you could say, just like if you have suppose you have a stringed instrument sitting off in the side of the room and you play a loud single tone, the string that is in resonance with that tone will start to vibrate. And so similarly, if we are attempting to tune ourselves to spiritual vibrations, then we will pick up those spiritual vibrations in the holy places and among the holy people. Since furthermore, he is a conscious being, he must work in consciousness, and through this he finds that good and evil are inside. He sees that he is only happy because he is conscious, that he is conscious that he is happy, and he is unhappy only because he is conscious of being unhappy. That in consciousness all evil exists, and in consciousness all happiness exists. So he learns to go within himself for everything. God teaches him that if the mind can be detached from the outside world, then no evil will exist for him. Matter is the cause of all misery, of all misfortune. The less we have to do with matter, the better it is for us. As the man's mind becomes pure, he learns this lesson. God purifies his mind, and he sees all within himself. He will see himself in all beings. God, with reference to his creation, is finite. He is infinite as to his mind and to his consciousness. So again, we see that this idea of the purity of the mind being necessary in order for us to see the God within, and that God itself is beyond dualities, but we are living in a world full of dualities, and so we tend to see both good and evil. And as he's saying, they exist in our mind. Our mind is processing all this information that it's getting from our sense organs and interprets them as good or evil. So the idea of all these yogas, of course, is to turn the mind inward and to purify the mind so that we can go beyond these dualities. So God never sleeps. He is always conscious. So in this world, we also only know different states of consciousness: the waking state, the dream state, and the sound sleep state. Thus we are conscious and God is conscious, and it becomes evident that if we want God, we shall have to search him out in our inner consciousness. We must always seek consciousness in consciousness. Just as we must seek a bird among birds, not among beasts, in the same way we must not search for God in unconsciousness. What is unconscious? Matter is dead, and conscious and unconscious. Therefore, God must not be sought in matter. We must seek him in consciousness, that is, inside our own self. All right, so this will take a little bit of explanation. You remember I'm very fond of quoting John Dobson, who used to give a series of lectures here many years ago. And he used to tell a story about he was at the conference in Chicago. I think it was the 1993 100th anniversary of the Parliament of Religions, and he was invited to speak at the Science and Religion section. And the topic that he gave was matter as sentiency. And of course, this was not a very popular topic. People in the question and answer section were arguing with him. And he finally said, I know. You think you're very sophisticated beings and you know where down is. But if you really want to know where down is, you hang an insentient piece of lead on an insentient string, and then you know exactly where down is. And his point was that matter has a certain sentiency. Now, it's not the kind of consciousness that we think of when we're talking about consciousness for us or for other living beings. And indeed, there's something quite distinctly different between a dead body and a body that's alive. But there does seem to be a rudimentary sentiency in all of matter. And if you think that Brahman is consciousness and all comes from Brahman, then everything does have to have a certain level of consciousness. But that's probably not a very good term to use, so that's why he used the term sentiency. And indeed, when you think about it, our sense organs depend on the atoms being able to respond to the different 5 energies, electricity, magnetism, radiation, kinetic energy, and what did I leave out? Gravity. So our sense organs respond to those energies because the atoms in the molecules in those sense organs are able to respond. For example, your eyes. Your eyes pick up the light radiation and transfer it into a sensible kind of reaction in your brain. And if the atoms weren't able to pick up that energy vibration of the radiation and transfer, then you wouldn't have eyes. You wouldn't be able to see. It's all due to the fact that the atoms in the molecules of the various the cone cells, your different cone receptors, they are able to respond to the different wavelengths of light. And so then you're able to be conscious of light energy. And the same thing goes for all of your sense organs. So our sense organs really depend on the sentiency of atoms themselves. But as I just mentioned, when the body goes, the eyes are still there and the atoms are still responding to if they're open, they'll still be responding to the light radiation as long as they haven't decayed. But you're not going to be seeing. There's not going to be any consciousness of seeing. So we have to be a little careful how we use these terms. So yes, in some sense, matter is dead and unconscious, but it's not completely unconscious. There's a certain sentiency to it because it flows from Brahman as well. Everything flows from Brahman, and so you can't draw too distinct a line in there. There's a spectrum. All right, you may say that God may be found outside, but in reality, world does not exist apart from your consciousness. You may be very devoted to your mother and father, but you fall asleep and forget them. Why? Because he who knows them has gone away. The conscious self has gone away from the senses, from the mind. Therefore, the external world no longer exists for him. When that conscious self comes back to his senses and his mind, you remember them. Therefore, you see that consciousness alone really exists in you, and all else is forgotten. And of course, we do know too, as he said right there in the beginning, that the consciousness isn't just a function of the brain, and he says it resides in the heart, but in some sense it also resides simply in your soul, your jiva, your atman, because we know from people's near-death experience that they have the sense of leaving their body, and then they can still hear, they can still see, they know what the doctors and nurses were saying or what the emergency people in the ambulance are saying. And so we have the sense that our consciousness and our ability to have some sort of sense experience is not restricted to the body, that the body might not even be functioning. The brain could be brain dead, your eyes are closed, you're not seeing anything physically with your eyes, and yet you have this idea of perception of sight. So all of this consciousness really resides in the Atman, which then manifests as an individual jiva. And so Now, when we don't have that sense, when we just fall asleep, obviously, if you just fall asleep, then you haven't left your body. Your consciousness hasn't left your body. It's still residing in your body. All right, the soul alone is beginningless and endless. That world which you expect to continue to exist after you leave it exists in the universal mind, and that universal mind exists in the universal consciousness. But the small world which exists in your individual mind dies with you. There are two parallel creations, as we shall show. What takes place in the universal creation may not take place in your creation. Suppose, for example, that a man has gone away to Bengal. Now, in God's creation only, his child has died. But he doesn't know it for 15 days. During that time, the death does not exist in his creation at all. He still thinks of his child as living, eating, playing in just the same way as when he was with it. Then the news reaches him, and the moment that he hears of it, the child dies in his world. This shows that there are two distinct creations. The consciousness in the universal mind, however, is the same as that behind your individual mind. They are not separate, for the infinite consciousness is one. So if you can make your individual mind merge into the universal mind, then you will no longer be able to distinguish your mind from the universal mind. When a devotee or bhakta, therefore, wants to go to God, he does the same thing as the jnani, who seeks to go behind his own consciousness to God's consciousness. Well, this reminds me of a very interesting story that was related by a young woman at the conference, the Snowmass conference. And she told us that one time when she was a little girl, she'd gone to a summer camp. And when she came home, she told her mom how she enjoyed it. And she said, "Oh, you know that friend so-and-so that I haven't seen for years, she was there too, and we had such a great time." And the mother stared at her and said, "She died so-and-so days ago. It was in the newspaper." But the girl had this consciousness of this playmate, a very real playmate in this camp, even though the girl had passed away. So the consciousness of that girl had somehow manifest a somewhat etheric form that this girl could comprehend. So one of these interesting stories. Now, of course, this, as we say here, we're trying to connect with this universal mind. And again, you have to be a little careful. Sometimes people that have psychic insights think that they are somehow enlightened. They can now see all things, but they're not. They're just connecting to maybe one or two other conscious minds. That's all. They haven't really connected with God consciousness. And of course, this is why in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras they warn against going after cities or powers, because they can become very distracting. In fact, I've known some devotees that in their early stages of spiritual practice gain the power to hear other people's minds. They hear other people's thoughts, and it becomes very annoying. They have enough trouble dealing with their own thoughts without having to deal with other people's thoughts. And this is also the difficulty that psychics have of sorting things out. You might think that a psychic is picking up wonderful impressions of some sort, but how do you know they're not picking up the mind impressions from some other being or from a past life of your being or something of that nature? It's very difficult for psychics to sometimes sort out all of the energies that they're experiencing. They're tapping into all these kind of waves of consciousness, but they can't always accurately discern what is the relevant pieces of information that they're getting. Yes?
Swami, what do you mean by like going after cities? Like, how does that happen?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can try to actively cultivate psychic abilities. You know, you want to be able to read other people's minds or something of that, or do remote viewing or something. And some people are born with some of these talents. Perhaps they cultivated them in a previous life or something. And sometimes they just come spontaneously. People don't pursue them, but they come spontaneously, and the suggestion by the scriptures and realized souls is to, if you get them, you can test it once or twice and then ignore it, because you need to go beyond it. Otherwise, it'll become a trap. You'll become fascinated with it. It'll become just yet another distraction, just like the things in the world of Maya are very alluring to us. They were very appealing to us. And these are at a slightly higher level, so they're even more appealing, and we feel like we're somehow special, that we can read people's minds or know the future or something of that nature. But they're just more distractions on a higher level. So, all right, at present, we live in the external world, and we believe that all our happiness and misery exist there. But when we begin to search inside, we find that all things exist within ourselves, that all consciousness is there. This is what is called introspection. Introspection is searching for God within. The more we practice this, the nearer we come to God. At first, a person may not understand it practically, but the moment that one realizes his own nature, then they will see that they are the self-existent one, independent of all the external world. Then they will be able to say, I cannot have come out of matter. I am spirit. I have come out of spirit, and to spirit I must go back. And where is spirit? Inside. Therefore, to go to spirit, I must go within. And when we say within, of course, what we're really referring to is that we're trying to ignore the sense organs' tendency to go outside and be simply conscious of our own true self. And we tend to think of that as inside. So that's really the idea there. He sees that all his environments are material, while he is spiritual. So he ceases to depend on his environment. And as he detaches himself from his environment, with it, his sense of I and mine vanishes. You see, we get this sense of I and mine because of the way we perceive the world. And we see things that we think of as ours, and we see things that we think of as others, and we see things that we would like to have, and things that we don't want. And so everything becomes oriented towards this sense of ego, where we looking at various things and we think, this is something I want, this is something I don't want, this is mine, you can't have it, you've got this and I want it. So all of these kinds of ideas need to disappear. And so these are all the ideas that spring from the perception of the material world. And so that's why we're trying to detach ourselves from the things in our environments. Such ideas, little by little, destroy his attachment towards the world. Then gradually, as with the sword of non-attachment, all the ties of the world are cut off. He goes deeper into his own existence and finds God. At that moment, his individual world disappears. He merges into God's creation and becomes one with him. Suppose there are two fields, one higher than the other. The upper field is full of water. Now, if you cut a channel, the water will flow naturally into the lower field until the water rises to the level of the upper field. Then the surfaces are no longer two. They become like one unbroken body of water. So when the devotee goes to God and draws only inspiration from God, then God's thought flows naturally into his heart, and there remain no differences between him and his Lord. For that reason, Sri Ramakrishna teaches us that God and his devotee are one and the same. So this is the idea of course, this is speaking from the devotional standpoint. And the dualistic standpoint, we're thinking of God as an incarnation or a being or a deity of some sort. And we've done devotional practices. We're focusing on that particular aspect of God. And we're trying to have a continuous thought of God flowing in our minds. And then that thought of God fills us to the brim until our consciousness is one with that consciousness of that particular manifestation of divine. God cannot be seen by all men. Being infinite, he cannot be perceived by the senses. But if the devotee merges himself in God, God's thoughts become his thoughts, and he cannot commit any blunder. Then people begin to come to him for counsel, because what he says is regarded as God's word. These are called the saints and seers, because their mind is one with God's mind. The moment a man becomes a little introspective and tries to go to God, God at once comes to him, purifies him of all past karma, and makes him one with himself. Thus, the Lord and his devotee actually become one. And that reminds one of the saying that if you take one step towards God, he'll take 10 towards you. So the moment a man becomes a little introspective and tries to go to God, God at once comes to him. So even a little effort on our part is magnified. By associating with the holy and pure, the mind grows pure. Attachment for the world decreases, and attachment for God increases until the world slips off entirely. And of course, that's the idea of the more you go towards the west, the further back the east becomes. By associating with the holy and the pure, the mind grows pure. Attachment to the world decreases, and attachment for God increases until the world slips off entirely. Then, as oil flows from a bottle into an unbroken stream, so the whole thought flows to God without any break. Of course, that's the goal of a meditation practice, where you attempt to continuously have a thought of God, and the metaphor is that it's like a stream of oil going continuously rather than drop by drop. That's the way it usually starts, right? We repeat our mantra and we think of it for a minute or two or for a couple of repetitions, and the mind wanders, and then we have to bring it back and a few more drops go in. But eventually we get to the point where we get longer and longer streams rather than just a single drop, maybe a little inch or two of a stream, and then maybe 3 or 4 inches of stream until the stream becomes unbroken. All right, where did I leave off here? All restlessness of body goes, all sense desires disappear. The mind is no longer disturbed or changed by these. It no longer concerns itself with the outside world. It becomes quiet and serene, as if the innumerable struggles of many lives had come to an end. When it thus grows calm and peaceful, when there is no wave or ripple on its quiet surface, in such a pure, unruffled mind, the true nature of God is seen. At that time, when a man realizes God inside himself, all fetters of the mind are broken asunder, all troubles disappear, all doubts are cleared off, and man's lifelong struggle ceases. But this is only possible when he is not held by any attachment to the world. When he realizes everything, he gets everything. By loving God and having non-attachment to the world, all things come to him. For this reason, wise men make it a point to love God above all other things, because that alone can bring peace to the mind and nothing else. They strive, therefore, to cultivate devotion towards God in order that they may realize him and attain to peace. So, of course, that is the advice, is to realize God and you gain everything. You don't have to look for all sorts of things in the world, that by getting God, you get everything you could possibly want. The next section is called Give God His Throne. Out of the formless, the formful has come into being. By formful existence, we mean the universe. For this universe is a universe of innumerable forms. Of course, that's the idea of Maya. Maya is the realm of name and forms. It's in time and space, and in time and space you get names and forms. That's how we get a sense of duality, a sense of subject and object. When the subject senses things in its what seems to be an exterior world, it gives it names and forms, and that gives it a feeling of separation from it. You know, there's that scene in Through the Looking Glass where Alice goes into the forest of no names, and there's this little fawn, and the fawn has no fear of Alice, and Alice has no fear of the fawn, but she can't think of the name of the fawn, and she can't think of her name. There are no names in this forest. Then as soon as they reach the edge of the forest, the fawn jumps out of the forest and is suddenly very frightened of Alice and runs away. So that's a very interesting metaphor that he had in there, of this idea of Maya being the realm of name and form. Now, every figure has one or more boundaries, boundary lines, and what has boundary lines must be finite. How can this formless existence, which is finite, come out of the formless, which is infinite? For we have just seen that out of the formless have come all these forms. The great Sri Ramakrishna used to tell us that such things are not impossible. The whole world of the senses is made up of formful things. But the memory of these is formless. And of course, Sri Ramakrishna gave the example of ice freezing into or water freezing into ice. So like icebergs forming out of in the ocean. So of course, usually the icebergs usually form on land and then fall into the ocean. But anyway, lakes freeze over and you get frozen parts of the lakes. So we can think of it that way, or you can put water in a freezer and form little ice cubes, and you can use different forms and get popsicles of different forms if you'd like. So indeed, out of the formless, we can get the idea of how we can get forms. The great Sri Ramakrishna used to tell us that such things are not impossible. The whole world of senses is made up of formful things, but the memory of them is formless. Physical phenomena are always formful, but the ideas cannot be formful. Even according to Western philosophy, every idea is formless, or unextended, as they say. For instance, there is a cat there, and I see it. I look again, and it is no longer there, but I remember that it was there. Now that memory, the idea of the cat, is formless. In my mind is all that I have been tasting, touching, smelling, seeing, hearing, and doing since my birth. But this mind of ours is said to be atomic in its nature. This is the view of many schools of philosophy. Kapila, for instance, as well as the Nyaya, says that the mind is atomic. It can think of only one thing at once. It can never think of two things at the same time. And you know, they've actually done experiments like that, because a lot of people think they can multitask and think of two things at once, but what they've seen is that the mind just flips very rapidly back and forth from one thing to another. It's not really thinking of two things at once. An atom is that which cannot be divided, and the mind is atomic. Now, of course, we have the idea that the atoms are divided, but he didn't have that idea back in his day. Because it also cannot be divided, and all that is indivisible must be formless. Hence, memory, being in the mind, must be formless. So some of these analogies are not really working anymore, but we'll give them a little slack for living over 100 years ago. Hence, memory, being in the mind, must be formless. In my memory, therefore, furthermore, are stored up all the impressions of all the lives that I have been living from time without beginning, not only of this universe in which I am living now, but of the many universes which existed before this universe was created. For the chain is endless, just as a wave rises up and goes down to rise up once more, so this creation rises up, goes down, and rises again. So, of course, we see more is interesting in those days. When he was writing this, this was before Edwin Hubble discovered that this was an island. There were other island universes out there, that the Milky Way universe that we thought of as being the totality was not the totality, that there were other universes out there, if you want to call that a universe. But now, of course, the whole universe is made up of all of those different galaxies. So the whole idea of universe shifts. And now we're looking through the James Webb telescope, and we find well-formed galaxies way out at the distant edges of the galaxy. So indeed, his idea here that these universes have existed from time immemorial, and even before this universe came out of the cosmic soup, there have been many, many universes. We see them back 13 billion years ago, way back at the beginning, what we thought was the beginning of the universe. Probably wasn't the beginning of the universe. The universe has probably been going on for eternity. All right, this is how this creation has been going on from time without beginning. And since I am a denizen of this creation, I too have been going on from time without beginning. For no Hindu philosopher will hold that Atma was ever created. So long as this creation runs on, I also am going on with it, because I am a part of it. So in this mind are existing all the memories of all these creations. All the big things as well as the small things are existing in this mind. And since what is in the mind must be unextended, all these memories must be unextended and hence formless. Yeah, I'm not sure his arguments are terribly sound about this, and exactly what he means by formless is also a little bit vague here. Certainly now we think of memory traces in the mind, and they have a certain form of memory traces in the neurons, but of course the soul has memories that aren't dependent on the brain. So in that sense, those memories are in some formless state of some sort, or some seed state in your cosmic mind that's not associated with your physical brain. So these are mysteries that I don't think we've really quite unraveled. And so we can probably go along with his idea that there's some aspect of formlessness to these thoughts and memories. Then once more the question arises. Certainly they're not dependent on the physical body, so in that sense they're formless. Then once more the question arises, how out of the formless existence has formful existence come? Now, if our ideas are formless, then since everything comes out of an idea, all forms come out of the formless. For example, you want to build a house. You have an idea, a formless idea of a house. Next, you draw this out on paper, and at last you build the house, which has definite form. In the same way, out of the formless idea of creation have come out all these formful entities. There cannot be two infinities, for in that case one would have to limit the other. So there must be one God. There cannot be two, and out of him must have come all this universe, and ultimately it will merge into him. But he is formless. Formless means infinite, as well as that which is infinitesimally small. Therefore, in our scriptures, the same God has been described as smaller than the smallest and larger than the largest. How can these two things be applied to the same God? Yet it is a fact. You know that extremes meet. Extreme cold, for example, has the power of burning. Well, of course, it's not exactly burning. You just get frostbite, but it feels like it's burning. It destroys the tissue just the same way. Whether you stick it in a flame or you freeze it, your tissue is destroyed, and in that sense, it's the same. So the scriptures describe this as the smaller than the smallest and larger than the largest in order to help us transcend our ordinary experience and to realize that in some sense Brahman, which we are going to personify as God, is not understandable in terms of the things we normally understand things for. We can't understand God in the same way that we can understand things in the world. And so it's described in these contradictory sentences, and that's, if you're familiar with Zen koans, that's one of their techniques, is they give you some sentence that you really can't wrap your head around in any kind of sensible way. And the idea is that you have to transcend your normal mode of thinking to a sort of thoughtless realm where God exists. So God is smaller than the smallest and larger than the largest. And in order to comprehend that, you have to go past all these dualities of size and shape and reach that formless realm where Brahman really is. What is the definition of God? God is one. He is absolute unity. And that which is absolutely one must have to be unextended. Why? Because extension is always the distance between 2 points. You cannot form any idea of extension without 2 points, one here and one there. Extension rests on the idea of here and there. Hence, therefore, every extension is between 2 points. The idea of extension presupposes 2. But by the definition, God is absolutely one without a second. He is homogeneous, elementary, simple in his nature. So he cannot be two. Besides God, there is nothing. He is all God, all spirit. Sri Ramakrishna used to say that sugar candy is sweet everywhere. Everywhere you may bite, above, below, and on the side, on that, but everywhere it is equally sweet. Similarly, God is the same everywhere. If then the idea of extension is based on 2 and God is absolutely one, he must be without extension. In that case, he must be a geometrical point, which, as described by Euclid, has neither extension nor magnitude. He is then smaller than the smallest. But at the same time, he has no boundary line, and what has no boundary line must be infinite. Hence, where there is no extension, that must be a point of infinity, and thus we see that God is both smaller than the smallest and larger than the largest. These you must have to conceive within yourself. When a man disentangles himself from the gross body, when he disentangles himself from the subtle body, and when he disentangles himself from the causal body, then only can he realize his true nature. And then he finds that he is pure existence, consciousness, and all blissfulness. All these are one and the same. They are not three different entities. When the idea of existence is there, there is consciousness. And because you love to exist, so the idea of happiness or bliss is also there. One cannot remain without the other two. And of course, again, going back to modern physics, Einstein showed that this is a 4D universe, but that the separation between you and everything that you perceive is actually objectively zero. We don't see it that way because we are having a subjective experience. Everybody's having a subjective experience. We think it's an objective world out there, but it's not. It's a subjective world. And if you do the mathematics on the physics, you find that the separation between you and everything you see is zero in the objective four-dimensional universe. So there is no separation between you and everything you see in space-time, but we see it away from us in space and backward in time. And so this is the secret of Maya. Maya is in space and time, and in space and time, you see things away from you in space and backward in time. And so we see this universe as 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. But in actuality, it's all one. It's not in space and time, it's beyond space and time. All right, we are not finished with this section. We will continue it next time. And we will conclude with the chant, which describes this process, that how everything comes out of the one, and yet the one never changes. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see, filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is, from Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace.
Swami, what did you mean by backwards in time?
Well, you don't see anything now. For example, the sun is